Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel. It's been a minute since I posted on the second channel. I've just been kind of busy. I had to pre-record a lot of content in advance for Toronto Regionals. But speaking of Toronto, I thought I would do a meta prediction video for what I think might be good in Toronto. Of course, Toronto is this weekend and I will be competing at Toronto Regionals. So I thought I would talk about kind of just my predictions of what I think the format will be like and all that good stuff. Let me move this over a little bit actually, so you can see all the cards. But yeah, I thought I would do like a meta prediction for Toronto. Kind of talk about what I think will be good and what the format will look like kind of going into Toronto and all that good stuff. And I thought I would talk about that here. So if y'all are new to the channel, the second channel, make sure to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed. But without further ado, let's just get the thing right off the bat. Lugia is going to be the best deck. And I think towards winning Lugia list is going to be net decked into Oblivion. I think a lot of players who want to go into Toronto and don't know what to play, a lot of them are just going to net deck Tord's Lugia deck, which isn't a bad thing necessarily. I think Tord has the best Lugia list. He's got the most consistent list, the strongest list. So I think a lot of people are just going to copy Tord's list. And I think that you have to be Lugia. If whatever you're playing in Toronto doesn't have a good matchup against Lugia, don't play it, because you're going to run into a lot of Lugia. I guarantee you, out of 9 matches, minimum, you're probably going to play against 4 or 5 Lugia decks. It's just going to be that popular of a deck. I could be wrong, but Lugia is going to be all over the place, and it's still like the best deck in the format. And Lugia is one of the only decks that actually beats itself, believe it or not. So you got to expect to see a lot of Lugia going in Toronto, but that doesn't mean there's going to be other decks too. I do think that the control deck has a lot of potential to see play. Obviously, Sanders' control deck has a very good matchup against Lugia, as you just use Yveltal, you thin their resources dry. It's a very strong anti-Lugia deck. The problem is the control deck doesn't have as good of a matchup spread as just you'd think. It's obviously got the good Lugia matchup, but then it might be good against other things. But it struggles against some decks, like Lost Box could be a problem. You do have the Ice Cube with the Wash Energy. You have that Ice Cube for the Reggie matchup, but you're going to struggle against a lot of other random decks out there, and you also have a bad Giratina matchup, which might be a big problem. I do think Sanders' control deck has room to actually evolve, though. A lot of Lugia lists are going to start playing Blissey, potentially. There's been a lot of word about Blissey V seen playing Lugia, because Blissey allows you to just kind of counter the Yveltal. They just use Cry Destruction, and then you just go Blissey, put the energy back on, and it's like nothing happened. So there's a lot of potential for Blissey to see play, and I think that's going to be a really good counter to control. So I think that the control deck has to figure out a way to deal with something like Blissey. Though you do have Miltank and Ice Cube, which are pretty good at like Blissey counters, but I do think Blissey is a bit of a problem for control, and I think that control has to adapt, and I do think that people are going to figure out more ways to improve upon the control deck, or just kind of adapt to what Lugia is going to do, and just adapt to the format going into this weekend. But I do think Control is still a good play. I think the issue with Control, though, is it's a hard deck to pilot, and a lot of players that don't have as much experience are not going to play Control because they don't know how to play Control. They don't know how to pilot it properly. While the Yveltal Control deck is not as hard to play as other Control decks, in my opinion, this is a bit more of an easier Control deck to manage because it's a little bit more straightforward and linear. But it still has a lot of little nuances, a lot of little plays you make, a lot of misplays you can easily make with the deck. So it's not a perfect deck to pilot, and it's not easy, but it still is a bit more easier to play than other control decks, I would say. But depending on the amount of good players that decide to play Control, Control may not be as popular as you might think. I think you'll have a higher chance playing against Control in like day 2 as opposed to day 1. Next up is, of course, Giratina. Now, this is just like the highest ranking Giratina deck that I saw from LAIC. It has a Raikou. I don't know if it's actually like the best way to play Giratina, but I just want to mention Giratina in general. I think Giratina is still like slightly decent in the format. It's basically just a more simplistic Lost Box deck, because you have like Lost Box elements, like you have the Cram and the Sableye. Some lists are going to play, you know, other attackers like Snorlax, as you see in Raikou, obviously, I guess is like something that I don't know if Raikou is really that good in general, but you get my point, right? But Giratina, I think in general, it's still okay. I think if you want to play something that's like safe and has like a okay Lugia matchup, I think Giratina might be the best deck to play. I think that it has a pretty solid Lugia matchup. Or not a solid Lugia matchup. It has like a pretty 50-50 Lugia matchup. It's really just like the best like safe play for this tournament, in my opinion, is probably Giratina. But I don't think Giratina is that good against Lugia anymore, but it still seems to be the best, like, the best safe play. Even though its Lugia matchup is 50-50, it's not the best play, but it definitely is the safest play. Still a bit of a harder deck to pilot, obviously, but I think it's probably like your safest bet, and I think you're going to play against a couple Giratinas. Giratina will be popular. It's still a pretty good deck regardless, and it's one of the only like tempo decks that can actually keep up with Lugia. Next up is Mew. Another deck that I think you got to watch out for is Mew. Mew is still really good, and it's another deck that has a pretty okay Mew matchup, or Mew matchup. Mew has a good Lugia matchup, sorry, is what I meant to say. Yeah, it has a good Lugia matchup still. Or not a good one, but it's still got like a 50-50 Lugia matchup. Mainly because Mew can knock out Lugias early on. It's still very strong. The Path build is still good. The Hero's Medal, obviously, is another cool addition here from LAIC. So Mew can go either way. You got the double turbo build or you got the Meloetta build. I think the Meloetta build is still the one that is going to be the most popular and the most played out of all the Mew decks, but you got to expect to play against a couple Mew at Toronto Regionals without a doubt. So if you still want to play a Drapion, I would still play Drapion in your deck. Still try to respect the Mew, because Mew will still be played. You're most likely going to play against a Mew deck at Toronto Regionals, so expect to see Mew, and you have to make sure your deck can actually beat Mew, because Mew is still going to be a bit of a problem going into Toronto. It's still going to be very popular. It's another, again, it's just like Giratina. It's another deck that like has a pretty okay matchup against Lugia. It's a deck that like you can actually stand up to Lugia, but still doesn't it's not auto win, but it's still like you have a chance. That's basically the same thing with Mew and Giratina, kind of the same kind of idea. Next up, though, is Lost Box. Now, Lost Box has, like, a few variants. You got the Rayquaza build, you have the Charizard Cramorant Sableye build, and then you have the Kyogre Raikou build. In my opinion, the Kyogre build is still the way to go, because Kyogre just does a lot more work for you. The problem with Lost Box is just you're going to get destroyed by Stoutland. I don't think Lugia is cutting Stoutland, because Stoutland is just too good of a card to have for Lost Box. And Lost Box is still, a lot of people just default to the fact that, oh, Lost Box has a very free free Lugia matchup, and then you play it and then you realize, it actually doesn't have a free Lugia matchup, because if they Stoutland you, you're in trouble. And Stoutland is pretty tough to deal with. Obviously, the Raikou is good for the Stoutland, and you even have like Snorlax, which can be good with a belt, but Stoutland is still a bit of a problem. If that Stoutland is going to knock out multiple Comfeys, you're probably going to lose. Like, if Stoutland is able to take 4 prizes, you're not beating Lugia. So, Lugia playing Stoutland is still a problem, and that is still something you have to respect. Though, I think Lost Box is still, like, a fairly okay deck regardless. It's another deck that, like, as long as you deal with Stoutland, I think it's got a very good Lugia matchup. You just have to get past the Stoutland, and I think Lost Box will always be able to beat Lugia. I think the Sableye Cramzard build is fine. It has a bit of a bad time against Stoutland, though. You can't really do anything about that. I originally thought of the idea of playing Galarian Zapdos, but they just have Dunsparce, and they're always going to play well, they might not bench Dunsparce, but in a best-of-3 scenario, if you Zapdos or Stoutland, they'll bench Dunsparce in the next game, and you have to try to Sableye it, and I feel like at that point, Stoutland's already going to have a lead on you on 4 prizes, and you just lose at that point. I think the Rayquaza build is okay. Kind of just the Kyogre build, but a little bit different. Instead of Kyogre, you use Rayquaza. That build's okay. I think the Kyogre build is still the way to go, because it helps you in mirror matches and stuff, and I just think Kyogre is still, like, a really good card. It's hard to kind of play around, too. It's really hard to counter Kyogre, because once they kind of set up the perfect combo for Kyogre to just drop the Aqua Storm on you, it's basically GG's at that point. That's not going to say, though, there's not going to be decks that can counter Lugia. Of course, you do have Arc Duraludon. I think the Arc Duraludon is going to be very popular this weekend, mainly because, one, it's easy to play. Arc Duraludon is one of the easiest decks to play. It's also very, like, efficient, and a lot of people just believe it has a good Lugia matchup. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually have the best Lugia matchup, mainly because Lugia can knock out the Duraludons before they evolve, and obviously the Yveltal Vacuum combo is very deadly. But as you can see, 3 big Paracel is probably the way to go when playing Duraludon, because you just have to make sure you get a big Paracel on your Duraludon so that it doesn't get knocked out by Yveltal. But the issue with Arc Duraludon is, well, it does have an okay Lugia matchup. It's really just down to whether or not Lugia gets the tempo on you before you get the tempo on them. If they are able to knock out a Duraludon V, you're always going to lose that game, because they'll go knock out Arceus, and then they'll knock out another Duraludon with Yveltal, and then you lose. So it's still very scary, but it's not totally unwinnable. And I think it's another deck that, like, takes an okay Lugia matchup. Not the perfect one. Again, I don't think it's perfect against Lugia, because using those Vs that get KO'd very easily by Lugia early on, and then also the Yveltal is a big problem. So it's not the perfect counter to Lugia, but it definitely is something that people are going to play, because people just assume that it has a good Lugia matchup. And I guarantee you, you're going to play against Arc Duraludon a couple times, because it's just a lot of people just believe it to be the perfect Lugia counter. In terms of other counters, though, there's also a Vika Regieleki. Now, this is a deck that I don't think is going anywhere. It's another deck that kind of can sneak under the radar. It kind of flopped at LAIC. I don't think it did very well. And it's considered to be, for a lot of people, it's considered to be a pretty good deck in the format, but it did flop at LAIC. But I think Vikavolt Regieleki can make a comeback in the format, mainly because it's still a pretty good deck against Lost Zone engine decks. And basically Lost Zone is, like, its best matchup. Lugia is obviously not good because they have the Dunsparce, but I think that it still can deal with a lot of different decks, and Item Lock is very powerful. it's just a deck that it wins games because it just cheeses the opponent a lot of the time. That's kind of the power of this deck. I just think you have to figure out how to beat the Lugia matchup a bit easier because, again, that Dunsparce is very problematic for this deck. Dunsparce makes this deck kind of weak, but I do think Regieleki Vikavolt has a lot of potential still. I think it's still an okay deck in the format, and honestly, if you're expecting to play against a lot of Lost Boxes, it just might honestly be the play for Toronto. Next up is the Beedrill variants. Now, I actually really like the idea of Beedrill right now in the format. A lot of people are sleeping on the idea of Beedrill, but when going through all the Lugia counters, Beedrill kind of pops up as one of the more interesting ones. Of course, with that persisting attack, instantly knocking out a Lugia is pretty powerful, and you're only giving up a single prize. Beedrill can also knock out Yveltal in one hit, as it does 110 damage with the other attack, so if for whatever reason Yveltal becomes a problem, you can also knock it out. I mean, you have persisting, I guess, but you never know. Now, I don't know the best way to play Beedrill. That's kind of where I'm at right now, is Beedrill seems to be good, but what is the best way to play it? Is it with Charizard and Inteleon? As you can see here, this deck did win an online tournament, or is Beedrill with Arceus the way to go? I'm eyeing up Beedrill, Arceus, Flying Pikachu. I think Flying Pikachu, Arceus, Beedrill is a pretty interesting and okay deck in the format, as you do have the Flying Pikachu, which can be good against Lost Box. You want to probably play at least 2 or 3 big Parasol in the deck, so you just kind of have Flying Pikachu with a Parasol on, and that can be very annoying to play against. You can obviously, you know, one-shot Lugia if you're able to take out the Dunsparce, and then you have the Persisting against Lugia. That's where I'm kind of standing here with the Beedrill variants. I'm a really big fan of Beedrill, and I think it's actually a pretty low-key busted play for Toronto. I'm eyeing up playing Beedrill myself. It's one of my top picks, actually, for Toronto, is a Beedrill deck. Still kind of figuring out the best way to play it. This Inteleon Charizard build does seem pretty cool, though. Lost City's no longer really that relevant. A lot of Mew decks kind of are just playing Path now. So you can definitely kind of tweak around with the idea of Beedrill Charizard, and I definitely like the idea of it. I think it is pretty good. And then next up is going to be Regis. This is another deck I want to play. The problem is Reggie just doesn't seem to be good right now. It's not good against Lugia. Lugia has Manaphy Dunsparce. They play Collapse Stadium, which can be an issue, and Lugia can just beat you because of Manaphy Dunsparce. That is just one of the most annoying combos that Reggie can play against. Now, Reggie could adapt to it. It could start playing heavy Boss's Orders again to try to counter the Dunsparce, because Lugia won't play Rod, and at that point, they've already done Summoning Stars. It's not like the Dunsparce is coming back into play anytime soon. The problem with Regis is just, again, it just kind of takes a bad matchup to Lugia, or not even a bad matchup, it just takes like a 50-50 to Lugia, or even like a 40-60 to Lugia, where you're at a disadvantage. Regice is good against Lugia, though. I will say that Regice can be pretty good against Lugia. But yeah, I don't think Regis is as good as it used to be. It still has okay matchups, but if Duraludon is starting to come back in the format, then you got to deal with Duraludon too, and that's already going to cause a world of problems for the Reggie deck. So, unfortunately, I don't know if Regis is really that good for Toronto, but, you know, someone can run Hob with it, I think, and you might run into 1 or 2 Lugia decks without Manaphy Dunsparce, or just without the Dunsparce, or just without the Manaphy, so the option is there, but I still don't think that Regis is the best play. I would have loved to play it. I was really just, like, I was bent on Regis for Toronto, but I really think that Regis just kind of has fallen off quite a bit, and I don't think it's the safe play anymore. I did want to mention a couple other decks here before we ended things off. So I want to talk about Palkia variants. So we got Palkia Kyurem, which it's okay. It actually didn't do bad in LAIC. There's a couple Kyurem Palkia decks that made day 2. I think that Kyurem Palkia is like probably like an okay play. A lot of people don't really care about Palkia anymore, and that does give Palkia the advantage it needs. I don't know how good the Kyurem build is. Obviously, Kyurem being able to one-hit KO Lugia is really good, and the fact that it does get to play Wash Energy is very helpful. It's very good to play Wash Energy, as Lugia will not be able to play Yveltal against Wash Energy, which does give you a pretty big advantage. So I honestly don't hate Kyurem Palkia in this format. Again, I think Wash Energy is just a very good card to have. I don't know if you really need Empoleon. Honestly, I really think you might want to play a heavier kind of Wash Energy, because you need to make sure you're countering stuff like Star Requiem and that amazing rare Yveltal. Now, there is, of course, normal Palkia, which, unfortunately, I think is kind of fallen off quite a bit. It's still not a bad play by any means. I think it can still win games. Roxanne Temple, Roxanne Path are still good combos. Palkia is still a very good deck when it goes first, and it just has a lot of power still. It's not a bad deck by any means, but I just think that it's kind of, it's not in favor anymore, but it's still not a bad play by any means. If you're honestly not comfortable with any of the new decks, Palkia just might actually just be the safer play, in all honesty, over something like Giratina. So I do think Palkia is okay. I think Palkia maybe still wants to play like the Wash Energy and stuff to try to counter the Yveltal, though you do have the Inteleon Raihan combo, which might be good. And then, of course, I want to talk about another weird Lugia deck, and this is, or weird Lugia counter deck, and that's actually going to be the Weezing Aerodactyl Pikachu deck. Now, this is probably a big meme. I don't know if this deck is actually legit, but people are hyping it up to counter Lugia. Obviously, you go Weezing against Lugia, and then you go Aerodactyl, and then you shut off Lugia from being able to do Summoning Star all game, and then you just Yveltal, Flying Pikachu them into Oblivion. The problem is, this deck is only specifically tailored to beat Lugia. Like, I guess it could beat Lost Box, but, like, I still think this is just a bad meme deck. It's a cool concept that honestly could be an idea worth exploring, but I don't think it's worth exploring. I think this deck is just bad. It is an interesting idea, though, and honestly, it does have a pretty good Lugia matchup, so, I mean, if you're looking to just farm wins against Lugia, this could be the play, but even then, I don't even think this deck is, like, guaranteed to beat Lugia. It's also very, like, inconsistent. It's not really a good deck against Mew either, so I don't know if this is a good deck or not, but people are hyping it up right now, and it, I guess, could be Lugia. And then finally, of course, we have Goodra. Thought I'd mention Goodra real quick, because I've seen a few Goodra decks in the online tourneys. I think Goodra's in a weird spot. It's not as good as it used to be. It still has the problem of Yveltal being an issue, and obviously Goodra has to play Big Parasol now. We'll have to see where Goodra goes. I know Lost Goodra is something that is still a potential play people could try out, and then, of course, you have the Arceus Goodra. So I think Goodra is still an interesting archetype that could still kind of sneak into the meta at any given time and maybe do well randomly. So it's not even like a bad deck still. It's just kind of, again, it's just Lugia. Lugia is just really good. Yeah, nothing else to say. Yeah, Lugia's really good. I guess briefly wanted to mention maybe Regidrago too, which I think Regidrago is just not ready to be good yet. I think we gotta wait for Regidrago to be good. I think rotation is when Regidrago is actually going to start being good. But I just wanted to get that out of the way here for the Arceus Goodra deck. I want to mention Goodra real quickly. It's another deck that is kind of could sneak under the radar and maybe do well. Who knows? And that'll be it for this video. That is my predictions for Toronto Regionals, mentioning all the decks and kind of running through each and every deck and how good they would be and all that good stuff. Meta manipulation confirmed. Now, believe it or not, the deck that I am most likely playing at Toronto Regionals was not in the list of decks I showcased. I know I briefly touched upon the idea of Beedrill. I am eyeing up a Beedrill deck for Toronto, but there's another deck I'm eyeing up, and I don't want to leak that just yet. That'll be a YouTube video probably on Tuesday, so you definitely don't want to miss out on that. Because I am playing a really cool deck for Toronto, most likely, that I haven't seen before, so I'm going to try that. But that'll be for me, and thanks for watching. And if you haven't subbed to the second channel yet, hit that sub button, leave a like on the video, and that'll be for me. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the meta for Toronto? I would actually be very curious to hear what you think about it, and bye-bye.